It's July 1st, 1916. We're in La Boisseille in northeastern France. Captain James Young peers out from his observation trench towards the enemy lines. He checks his watch. It's 7:27 a.m. There's 1 minute to go, and his heart is pounding in his chest. 3 months of work. 3 months of blood and sweat in cramped, dark tunnels beneath the enemy position, and it all leads to this moment. Young's hands are clammy on the detonator switch. This has to work. Along this section of the line alone, 10,000 men of the British 34th Division will advance. As it stands, they're walking into certain death. The Germans are dug in very well, and their defences are almost impregnable. The lives of these 10,000 men and others depend on Young and his engineers. Failure is not an option. His watch ticks on. 7:28 a.m. and Young presses the detonator. For a moment, there's nothing. Then, a cacophonous explosion. A mushroom cloud of debris sails 4,000 feet into the air and disappears above the layer of mist. Then it scuds down like thick, dark rain. 100 meters of German defensive work and more than 6,000 enemy soldiers gone in a flash. A piercing ringing hangs in Young's ears. Around him, his men grin. Success. They even give him the thumbs up. They don't know it yet, but this explosion is the loudest sound in human history up to that point. Early risers back in London would have heard it with their morning papers. Slowly, that ringing subsides and is replaced by another sharp, shrill sound. All along the lines, there is the blare of whistles, the signal to advance. Men scramble from trenches and make the perilous trudge across no man's land. It's 7:30 a.m. and the Battle of the Somme begins. For several weeks, troops have known this only as the day. They've trained for this and prepared themselves mentally and physically. Now the day is here, and all hell is breaking loose. Shells crash in front of the advancing men, but these are friendly shells. They are the high explosive ordnance of the creeping barrage, fired by British guns to shield the advance and shatter any obstacles. But beyond this curtain of shell bursts, enemy machine guns rip into life. The advancing troops are caught between the two, in a maelstrom of lead and steel. For Major Alfred Bundy of the Middlesex Regiment, advancing towards Auvergne, it's all too much. The din was deafening, the fumes were choking, and visibility was limited in the dust and clouds from exploding shells. It was a veritable inferno. Suddenly, appalling rifle and machine gun fire opened against us, and my men commenced to fall. I dropped into a shell hole. To my right and left, bullets formed an impenetrable barrage. Exposure of the head meant certain death. In all directions came pitiful groans and cries of pain. Several miles north, at Beaumont Hamel, 90-year-old Private George Mayne of the Royal Fusiliers is advancing in a state of total bewilderment. He sweats under his heavy kit, and his feet skid and slither as the chalky earth breaks under him. Keep going on is the order. Don't stop, don't pause. But in the morning mist, he can barely see 10 paces in front of him. Around, he hears the pop of rifles and the rattle of machine guns. Someone nearby is struck, surely a friend, one of his mates from the regiment, but there's nothing he can do in the moment. The wounded, the dying, and the dead are left together on the battlefield. Hopefully, the stretcher-bearers will find them later. For now, though, anyone who can still walk and can still hold a rifle must keep on going. Some never even make it out of their trenches. Just before the assault began, Lance Corporal Charles Bartram noticed that his officer had become unexpectedly sentimental. In Charles's own words, he handed me a torch and said if I got through, I was to take it home as a souvenir. I took it home and have still got it." After handing over the torch, the officer turned from Charles and peered over the parapet, where he was unceremoniously struck in the face with a bullet. This is the infamous first day of the Somme, the worst day in the history of the British Army. So, how did we get here, with these two vast armies facing off against each other, spilling gallons of blood over just a couple of 100 feet of no man's land? Well, it all began in 1914, with the race to the sea. As the British, French and Belgian forces of the Entente repeatedly tried to outflank German forces to the east, they formed the battle lines that remained for most of the war. With the front lines drawn, both sides dug in. The result was thousands of miles of trenches, with the bombed-out, treeless landscape of no man's land in between. But to win the war, one side would need to break through, and this meant attacking. With that, the 10-month Battle of Verdun began. To the north, the British had a plan in response. They would launch their own assault along the Somme River, drawing German manpower and resources away from Verdun, relieving the siege. The British command, led by Douglas Haig, also had another objective: to break the stalemate and punch a hole through the German lines. If they could break through the 3 German defensive lines, they could deploy their highly mobile cavalry forces through the gap and break the stalemate on the Western Front. Before this mammoth assault began, British forces dug tunnels through the chalky earth beneath the German trenches, laying 19 mines under the enemy line. The largest of these mines were placed near Beaumont-Hamel, Fricourt and La Boiselle. It was one of the 3 La Boiselle mines, named Lochnagar, that our friend Captain James Young was responsible for. Detonated together just before 7:30 a.m. on July 1st, the combined explosion was the largest of the pre-nuclear age. With the dust still settling, the attack began. Morale was high. If the British and Commonwealth forces could just sweep through these holes in the line, they'd easily hit their targets. The villages of Gomcourt, Beaumont-Hamel, Thiepval, Poisiers, Mametz and Montauban should be in the British hands by day's end. This was, of course, not how it played out. Not even close. In the south, the forces attacking Montauban achieved their objective, but almost everywhere else, the attack floundered. It was an utter disaster. British and Commonwealth forces suffered 57,470 casualties in those opening engagements, and of these, 19,240 were killed. This was partly because of the creeping barrage. It hadn't worked as expected. In some places, it moved too quickly. Troops couldn't keep up, and by the time they arrived at the German lines, the enemy was back in position. Elsewhere, it was simply ineffective. Soldiers, expecting their way to be clear, became ensnared in barbed wire that had survived the blasts. Many were cut to ribbons as they struggled against this wire, and were then left to die in no man's land. And so, nearly 20,000 lives were lost, to gain just a few square miles. 20% of Commonwealth deaths on the Somme came in that first 24 hours. But with the French still fighting at Verdun, the British were committed. The Somme offensive must continue. It couldn't be allowed to stall. And this meant much more misery to come. 2 weeks after that harrowing first day, the British were back on the offensive. The second phase of the Battle of the Somme was beginning, this time with an attack along a much shorter front, centred on Montauban. Actually, British doesn't do justice, by the way, to the mix of nationalities that were involved here. These soldiers came from right across the Commonwealth, from the Caribbean to Africa, India and Australia. Later in the battle, they'll be joined by Canadians and New Zealanders. These men performed bravely and suffered terribly. On July 14th, the Indian 20th Deccan Horse and 34th Poona Horse, along with the British 7th Dragoon Guards, conducted a cavalry charge at High Wood. They'd been kept in reserve simply because a cavalry assault across no man's land would have been suicide. In the words of historian Nigel Steele, the terrain and nature of the battle were not suitable for cavalry, so they had to wait for around a fortnight before they saw action. British troops had captured a large amount of ground, and the idea was that the cavalry would exploit those gains. But this was still a very perilous charge. The three units suffered a combined 102 casualties. As one Indian soldier said, "This is not war. It is the ending of the world." 5 days later, Commonwealth troops launched an offence on Frommeya, beginning what has been described as the worst 24 hours in Australian history. The idea was to exploit apparent German weaknesses in the area, puncturing the line at Frommeya and taking the high ground known as the Sugarloaf. But if they thought this was going to be a walk in the park, they were woefully misinformed. As soldier Jimmy Downing remembered, the air was thick with bullets, swishing in a flat, crisscrossed lattice of death. Hundreds of men were mown down in the flicker of an eyelid, like great rows of teeth knocked from a comb. By the morning of July 20th, 1,700 Australians and 500 British troops were dead. Frommeya had been another disaster, but bloody progress was being made to the south. The Montauban front had moved around 2 miles and was now beyond Longueuil. Amid this fighting, the 1st South African Brigade was given a terrifying order. They must take the tangle of beech and hornbeam trees that formed Delville Wood. By early morning on July 14th, the South Africans had pushed deep inside this wood. But what happened next would cement the 1st South Africans' place in the history books. Pinned down by German sniper fire from the tree canopy, the brigade attempted to take defensive positions. A brutal counterattack later that night saw men grappling with bayonets and pickaxes in the dark. The fighting was ferocious, but as dawn rose, the 1st South Africans still held the wood. This then went on for 3 days, until the Germans had a brainwave. Instead of taking casualties with frontal assaults, they could simply smash the position with artillery. Now, South African soldiers fell in their scores, ripped apart by shell burst and bomb blast. The ground they spent the last days and nights defending was churned into a mire, stained with South African blood. The words of Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Nibbs: "It was a terrible job. Trees were cut down in front of us, shells burst all around. I got it in the elbow. At the dressing station, they bandaged me up and advised me to bolt for it. I shall never forget that run as long as I live. I saw men blown to pieces, and men lying wounded and killed all along the road." Despite the bombardment, the South Africans held the wood until July 20th. Their total casualties may have exceeded 75%. And when they finally withdrew, Piper Sandy Grieve of the Black Watch saluted them by playing a march on his bagpipes. Grieve was a veteran of the Second Boer War. Now he paid tribute to his former enemies, who had become his sworn comrades. It would be another 6 weeks before Commonwealth troops secured Delville Wood. Victory at the Battle of Guichy on September 9th ended German resistance in the area, and the second phase of the Battle of the Somme came to an end. The second stage had actually been a qualified success for the Entente. After the disaster of the first day on the Somme, there had been some progress. But as always, each mile of progress had been paid for with so much blood. This has become key to our perception of the Somme over the last century, young men making the ultimate sacrifice for just a few square metres of ground. And for those who survived, the horror was often too much to bear. Many found it difficult to share their experiences. George Rudge was one of these survivors. He was only 17 when fighting commenced at the Somme. He'd lied about his age, desperate to join up and do his bit. Rudge's family would later remember how the old soldier would barely speak about what he'd seen at the Somme. But in time, he did share his painful stories. Rudge told of seemingly hopeless advances, as if his entire unit was being sacrificed to what he referred to as a wall of steel. To quote the old man, Advancing alongside me was one chap who had the bottom of his jaw blown off and still kept going until he dropped. Despite all this, though, Rudge maintained his humanity. When asked how he felt after killing his first German, Rudge replied, "I remember thinking that he looked old enough to have a family, and I felt very sorry." Another soldier, Private John Kirkham, was serving in the Manchester Regiment when he found himself fighting for his life with an enemy soldier at close quarters. Kirkham had been trained to use a small steel-headed club known as a knobkerrie, but he hoped he'd never actually have to wield it. I hit out with the club and it sank deep into his forehead. In the scuffle, his helmet flew off. I saw that he was a bald-headed old man. I've never forgotten that bald head, and I don't suppose I ever will. Poor old devil. For reasons like this and others, the Somme has become a bit of a byword for attritional warfare, much wagered and little gained. Even today, it carries the same association, tiny advances paid for with heaps of bodies. And this association is fair enough. This place was hell on earth. Young men from all corners of the globe squared off against one another in trench networks and shell holes, and when they died horribly, more young men were poured in to take their place. But all of this has given rise to some problematic ideas, and there's a very popular one in English culture, which is the whole lions led by donkeys thing. And basically the idea here is that the First World War generals were blundering idiots, sending division after division into the meat grinder, and then repeating the process while learning nothing about what was happening in front of them. And this is a bit of a myth. From the war's outset, the collision of industrialized military technology and outdated tactics led to sickening casualties. Generals like Douglas Haig knew that they would have to overcome this if they wanted to win the war without an inordinate amount of bloodshed. So they would need new methods and new ways to break the deadlock. These generals were actively trying to avoid mass casualties by changing their approach. This meant things like creeping barrages, but it also meant more sophisticated trench networks and improved battlefield medicine. Later in the war, the arrival of planes and tanks led to the development of combined arms tactics. In short, constant evolution and innovation had transformed warfare by 1918. In November 1914, troops marched in tight formation, meeting enemy machine guns at a walking pace. But by 1918, infantry, aerial forces and armour worked together to achieve a decisive victory. This transformation just wouldn't have been possible without real developments in tactics and machinery. At the highest level, military philosophy adapted and evolved. Strategic errors from commanders certainly did cost lives, there's no avoiding this fact, but the lions led by donkeys trope is simply false. It was a new war. There was a lot of costly trial and error. And in fact, if we look at the third and final phase of the Battle of the Somme, we can see more of this trial and error in practice. The first of this last phase began at Frère Cossiet on September 15th. This time, there was a new weapon on the British side: the tank. Soldier Sidney Taylor remembered. We saw these tanks for the first time. A dozen tanks coming over shell holes, no stopping. Didn't matter what they came over, they got over it all right. It was horrifying. It gave you a funny sensation to think that all these were coming and they were on our side. They weren't against us. For Cecil Lewis of the Royal Flying Corps, all this was going to change everything. Hope was high. We thought, if they can get through the third line defences, we can put the cavalry through and the whole war will become mobile again. And Lewis was kind of right to be optimistic. These tanks did strike terror into the German defenders. Across the battlefields, there are stories of bullets bouncing off metal plating as the vehicles rolled sluggishly towards the German lines. But as for ripping through the third line defences, well, with this prediction, perhaps he was getting a little ahead of himself. Despite some successes, these lumbering beasts were not a decisive factor. Many were knocked out or floundered in mud and shell holes. Some simply broke down. 49 tanks were supposed to be involved in the battle, but only 6 reached their third objective. By the second day of fighting, only 3 were still operational. Nonetheless, Flers-Courcelette was a victory for the Entente. The front line moved forwards a further 2 miles in some places. But yet again, it was costly. Entente forces suffered nearly 30,000 casualties. This would be the final general offensive on the Somme. On November 18, 1916, British Commander-in-Chief Douglas Haig gave his order. The fighting would cease. The Battle of the Somme was over. So, what had changed? Well, the answer is simple. Casualties. Too many soldiers were dying. There had been some successes at the Somme. From July to November, the front line moved about 6 miles. German forces lost up to 600,000 men and were considerably weakened. And the distraction did contribute to a French victory at Verdun. But there was no breakthrough in the lines, and with British and Commonwealth casualties now at 420,000 and French losses at 200,000, the cost was just too dear. On both sides, more than 1 million men had lost their lives between July 1st and November 18th, 1916. So the Battle of the Somme was over, but the bloodshed on the Western Front was certainly not. Over the next 2 years, 2 million more soldiers would die on the battlefields of Western Europe. But to bring this sorry tale to a close, I want to return to someone that we met earlier on. When we left George Main, he was advancing across no man's land on the first day of the Somme, pushing forwards as his comrades fell around him. George did make it, but in the confusion he lost his platoon. Leaping down into the German trench line, he found only eerie silence. I saw nobody there, neither friend or foe. In the next trench, George finally encountered an enemy. I see a German soldier lying on the parapet with fixed bayonet. But this soldier was no threat. Ashen-faced and with wheezing breath, the gravely wounded man could only repeat the same 2 words over and over. Wasser, Wasser, mortar, mortar. As George approached, the wretched figure raised his hand in salute. George returned the gesture, then he knelt down and offered the man a drink. I am glad to this day that I gave him a drink from my precious water. For a moment or two, George and his companion were not enemies. They were not soldiers at all. The custom and convention that required one to kill the other simply melted away. They were just 2 young men, barely older than boys, whose paths happened to cross in a nightmare of death and fire. Their encounter lasted barely a minute, but neither would forget it for as long as they lived. George would live almost 6 more decades, but of course for his new friend, it's unlikely that he saw out the hour.